Palestine is at the heart of American politics, whether you like it or not. It's at the heart of freedom of speech. It is at the heart of anything in relation to due process. It is in relation to the separation of powers. It is in relation to the very liberty that Americans hold so dear to their hearts.
Welcome back to another episode of In the Meanwhile. I'm Nora Kenworthy.
And I'm Marcus Harrison Green. You know, Nora, somehow, someway, we've clawed our way through yet another week of unhinged headlines, soul-sucking discourse, and policy decisions that make you wonder if they were crowdsourced from the pits of hell.
Seriously. Somehow we are still here. I was going to compare it to a roller coaster, but I'm actually not sure there have been a lot of ups. It's mostly just terrifying drops over and over again.
Yeah, and you know, we're not even talking Six Flags here. We're talking about some janky-ass death trap at a county fair roller coaster where the safety bar is literally just a suggestion.
So true. Although there's a sick part of me that really loves county fairs and they're deadly roller coasters. Overpriced death traps and all. It's one of my favorite parts of summer.
Yes, well, I have to say, speaking of overpriced death traps, we have Gaza, which is basically what happens when the empire writes the rules, funds the weapons, and then acts shocked at the body count.
That is quite a segue.
Yeah, there was really no easy way into that. It's just basically the conversational equivalent of a DJ pulling the aux cord mid-banger. It's a total vibe kill. I get it. But also there's just no cheeky way to tee up what we're about to dive into. It's heavy. It's all too real. And, you know, we're talking today about the political and humanitarian crisis in Palestine and how U.S. solidarity with Palestinians has only grown, particularly over the past few years.
And the genocide in Gaza over the past few years, like others before it, truly defies adequate description. It goes beyond language in its horrors. We've all had to bear witness to it on our cell phones, on our social media feeds.
Yeah, and for some of us, even at our dinner tables. I think I've shared with our listeners before that my partner is Jewish, and there's definitely been some, shall we say, temperature rising conversations that I've been privy to between her and her family. Goodness. And ultimately, though, Nora, I mean, the U.S. here is just so heavily implicated in all this, and not just as Israel's staunchest ally, but as a major funder of this war. The U.S. gives more aid to Israel than any other country around the world. And even as Doge was decimating other foreign aid programs, the U.S. was committing more aid to the Israeli-backed and very highly controversial Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, or GHF. Even as we record this, hundreds of Gazans have been gunned down at food distribution sites run by GHF.
Yeah. And so I think in that context, it's understandable then that many Americans have very strong feelings about their own government's role in this conflict. And it's a role that keeps growing. On the other hand, support for a ceasefire has been rapidly growing among the U.S. public. Even as students, academics, writers, everyday people have faced increasingly targeted persecution for expressing pro-Palestinian or even just anti-genocide views. It's a lot.
No, it is a lot. And that's why we're particularly excited to have a guest with us today who can help us make sense of all this and whose recent book offers some light in very dark times and just might keep you away from the ketamine for just one more hour. So, yeah. No promises on that, but yeah.
It is a distinct honor to have my friend and colleague Karam Dana with us today. Karam is the Alison McGregor Distinguished Professor of Excellence and Transformative Research and the founding director of the American Muslim Research Institute at the University of Washington, Bothell. Karam is a Palestinian American who was born in the city of Al Khalil in Hebron in the West Bank. His research examines how race, Religion, Economics, and Politics Shape Identities and Political Orientations in the Middle East and the U.S. He's the author of a gorgeous new book titled To Stand with Palestine, Transnational Resistance and Political Evolution in the United States. Karam, thank you so much for spending time today talking about this important topic.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So for a very long time, Palestine has often been referred to as a question, as in the Palestine question, or as in the title of a famous book by Edward Said, which you mentioned, The Question of Palestine. And I think in some very powerful ways, as I was reading your book, I was thinking about how you are showing that Palestine is increasingly also an answer to questions that we have here in the United States and elsewhere. Questions like, what does resistance to settler colonialism look like? Or what is the true test of solidarity and humanity in our times? So I guess when you started writing this book, what questions were you hoping that it would begin answering, in particular for Americans who are thinking about Palestine and Israel and their relationships to this conflict?
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to share some of my thoughts today. And it's, the interesting thing about this book is that it really talks about not only Palestine as a geography per se, but rather as an idea in addition to this. And there's an identity associated with the word Palestine. Sure, it's geography defined, but it is now has become transnational in terms of its nature. So that's the first part, which, I get into the book detailing what does it mean to have transnational identity as Palestinian? What is the Palestinian transnational identity? And I think this can actually be used to describe a number of diaspora communities that have lived in spaces that are not necessarily within the geography in which they define their identity by. But the interesting thing here, in addition to this, I also think the case of Palestine for the past 77 years and counting is really a classic case of settler colonialism. And oftentimes there's a question in terms of how historical fact can be distorted, or half a fact can be, in fact, used to paint and kind of describe an entire narrative that is not entirely accurate. And I think part of the problems that we find when it gets to Palestine, a lot of these scenarios really have taken roots quite deeply in terms of how Western society sees and views the question of Palestine and or Israel. And I mean, I say and or Israel because when we talk about Palestine, we're talking about Israel, Israel after 1948. And when we talk about Israel and intentionally try to not talk about Palestine, we're in fact also talking about Palestine, who are two sides of the same coin, whether you like it or not. And the intentional erasure effectively becomes in by itself heightening the absence of a people, a heightened an absence of an identity. So speaking of heightened, I think in a sense, settler colonialism, highest levels of settler colonialism can be observed and studied and looked at and described. And really, like, it cannot be as clear as that in the case of Palestine, right? So I think we're able to understand systems of oppression in ways that are a lot more complicated and a lot more nuanced if we look at Palestine. I mean, I'm going to use the example of Ta-Nehisi Coates, for example. Ta-Nehisi Coates was a Zionist. I mean, 2014, he wrote a book about the case for reparations, suggesting that the return of Jewish people to their ancestor homelands, which of course there's something about that we have to discuss. But him making such an assumption, he says this is the perfect reparation model for African Americans. And a lot of people that was 2014. It took about 9-10 years for him to really change his views. In particular, it was a trip in 2023, in the summer of 2023, where he went and visited the West Bank. Actually, he visited my town, Al Khalil. And, that actually made it into the message, as you know. But in addition to that, him being someone who has talked about oppression. He has talked about the inequality of different minority groups in the United States, but in particular, of course, when talking about marginalized communities, particularly African American community in the U.S. and the history that we've had for a long time of racialization, subjugation, dehumanization, he saw that. I mean, he basically says, what I saw here is simply, the Jim Crow South. That's it. It was very clear. So I think, in the sense, the case of Palestine can be utilized and has been utilized as a way for us to understand systems of oppression in a broader sense. Now, when you mention the word solidarity here, and I think this is quite an interesting thing, is that when we think about solidarity, we talk about comparisons, we talk about systems, again, systems of oppression, ways through which resistance against such systems of oppression takes place, whether it's in the United States, Ferguson, for example, whether it's in South Central LA, for example, or whether it's in other impoverished communities. We talk about, I can give you a list of cities and towns where it's systematically how the politics of those places really marginalized, wholesale communities, in particular, of course, the African American community. And I think all oppressed people are able to identify with one another. And this is, for example, I'm going to end on this, is there's something about the fact that, the global South has always understood the question of Palestine since day one. And it's not a surprise that the global South understood and continues to understand the question of Palestine because the global South was pretty much colonized, and they understand what colonialism means. And the legacy of colonialism makes people in the global South understand this better, obviously. It is the Western, quote unquote, the Western world, as we call it. And again, former colonizers and offsprings of former colonizers in terms of state politics are the ones who are now operating in a way where they don't effectively understand the struggle of the people. So,
yeah, actually, you had brought up Ta-Nehisi Coates, and I, want to give some love to another Black intellectual, Mark Lamont Hill, who had a book called "Accept Palestine," I believe, and when he talks about how even in progressive movements and so forth, for the longest time in America, they could see oppression, they could see, domination and colonialism in everything except, right, the Palestine situation. And so I want to ask you this, like, why did it take so long, particularly in the United States, for folks to wake up to fully wake up, I should say, to what was going on in Palestine?
Thank you, Marcus. This is a really interesting question, and you mentioned Mark Lamont Hills with Mitchell Plitnick is his co-author of the book, Except for Palestine, right? And I think the interesting thing, this PEP, Except for Palestine, that's a term that has been coined about a decade or so ago to describe the fact that people are progressive, as you've mentioned, with regards to really most progressive issues, except for Palestine. I have attributed this to a number of things, particularly, I think, the forces of how Orientalism has operated deeply in terms of how the United States works. There's become a cultural kind of affect to it, effectively, even in the most progressive circles, even in terms of in spaces where people want to understand more, they're just unable to because of the lack of a variety of things. And I in the book, I kind of highlight the changes that have taken place over 25, 30 years or thereabouts that have allowed more space for these conversations. Now, going back to the progressive movement, right? The progressive movement in the United States also includes white feminism. Okay. We also understand that there are issues with how white feminism operates in terms of thinking about within transnational spaces. So I think this is one way to say this, is that within the progressive movement, we still have issues. We have problems. We have incomplete ideas with regards to equality. And I also want to highlight another book that actually came out. It's called Tolerance is a Wasteland. And that book is by an amazing scholar, Sari Makdisi from UCLA. And Sari Makdisi happens to be the nephew of Edward Said, by the way, and in which basically he actually digs deeper into the conversation as to why the progressive movements have really neglected Palestine. And provides really interesting, more interesting and more deep answers to this question. And it really has to do with a variety of different cultural rationales that are really behind it. In terms of technical things, education is quite limited in the US. In the United States, we don't necessarily, social studies is something rather limited. It doesn't really take us into the depth that is needed that other countries have, So I can go on and on, but I think I also want to, the last thing I want to mention in relation to this is that anyone that has taken and continues to take the side of Palestinians in terms of simple justice, to just call for Palestinian justice, has been labeled, and more or less, and again, I'm kind of somewhat generalizing here, has been labeled as an anti-Semitic, right? And we understand the historical connection to the suffering of the Jewish people in Europe. But the thing here that I want to highlight is that it's becoming much more of a phenomena whereby people are accused of things that they themselves are not, and people are accused of being anti-Semitic, and they themselves are Jewish. They themselves are either Holocaust survivors or children of Holocaust survivors. And so there's that piece of the conversation as well. And there's another layer to this, is that how the Jewish American community for the longest time in the US has been on the side of social justice. I mean, there's an ethic, a Jewish ethic known as tikkun olam, which is healing the world or fixing the world within Hebrew tradition. Now, the interesting thing about this is that it really, you find that taking shape in action within the Jewish community at large. But when it gets to the question of Palestine, you find that it's rather limited, unfortunately. But it's increasingly becoming much more prevalent. So during the civil rights movement, for example, the Jewish American community played a significant role in making these laws pass, obviously, but also that pressure that was needed, the critical mass. Jewish Americans were part of that, a very much part of this conversation. So those who are being accused of being anti-Semitic because of their views on Palestine, they see a conflict in their minds. So if I were to stand in this, it means that I stand against Jewish people. And once I stand against Jewish people, which I don't, so it becomes kind of a moral dilemma, rather than something that is a moral dilemma that is complicated, that in fact it should be a lot less complicated than it is. So I think this is something that has plagued the progressive movement in the United States. Again, not only in relation to Palestine, feminism, and other issues, but I think ultimately, I'm hoping, and I'm sure we all hope, is that equality will have no, will have no preconditions. Let's put it that way.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for talking about that weaponization of complexity. That it definitely, I think, is a hallmark of what's going on right now.
So, Karam, as I was reading this book and also admiring its incredibly beefy notes section, this is one of the most heavily researched books I've seen in a while. But it feels a bit like a book that might have taken a lifetime to write in some ways, right? It's obviously bound up in your own personal history, but also in decades of scholarship that you've done on these topics. And I don't envy you also trying to finish this book in the wake of all of the events that have followed October 7th, 2023. But you write in the preface to the book that a lot of what you've written there, those trends that you're observing, that you're studying in the book, really were only reinforced by the events and aftermath of October 7th. So can you help our listeners understand a little bit more about what those trends are that you're trying to kind of highlight in the book, and how the sort of transnational solidarity with Palestine has changed over the last few decades?
Thank you. It's basically, that question is the entire book, the answer to it. So bear with me. So I finished the book before October 7th. Okay. October 1st is when I actually finished it and sent the manuscript.
Oh,
yeah.
God.
But the thing is that, and I was like, okay, is there changing and so on? But what I noticed happening was the idea of the escalation that I meant it, that I kind of discussed and debated and kind of highlighted. And I noticed that, in the sense, what I had seen, what I had envisioned, was reinforced by what I had seen, in the sense that, the escalation of the fight, how mainstream conversations push against new voices. I also want to say, ultimately, the more you push against the mainstream will have to change. So the book really was motivated by certain observations that I've had, as you can imagine. And the fact, again, it's my positionality, my own personal identity, but I also am a scholar of Palestine and the region and the United States. So I study race and ethnicity in the context of the US and politics, right? On the one hand, the racialization of African Americans, racializations of Latinos, Latinx communities, racialization of Arabs and Muslims on the one hand, but I also study Palestine and the region, and I do public opinion surveys there, and I do interviews. So in a sense, bridging those two worlds. Had I not done these two kind of scholarship levels, I would not have been able to think and conceive of or write and successfully. I mean, these ideas are there, but like, to actually execute ideas successfully is a whole different challenge. So I have been perplexed. Again, this is kind of the motivation for the region. Why is it that Americans don't understand the plight of the Palestinians? They could easily understand the plight of the Ukrainians, for example, in contemporary times, but they don't understand the question of Palestine. It's easily possible to sympathize with the underdog in the context of American culture, but not when it gets to Palestinians. Why? And I've long been perplexed by this. I mean, of course, the simple answer is that there's Orientalism. And Orientalism is deeply rooted. Again, Orientalism is the lens, or rather the distorted lens through which the West has traditionally looked at the Arab world, Arabic-speaking world, Islam, Muslims, and the Middle East. And in a sense, it's kind of conflating different identities and in very ambiguous geographies to speak about peoples that are not actually real. Like, I mean, it's an invented ahistoric concept. But Orientalism is deeply rooted in American society. It continues to be. But then all of a sudden, we started noticing these things happening, right? And in particular, I'm talking about 2010s. What has happened? People started talking about Palestine slowly. Now, this isn't to say that Palestine and Palestinians have not been talked about in the U.S., for example. And again, I'm just also talking here specifically about the United States, right? It's not that Palestine has not been talked about. There have been amazing people who have talked very prolifically about Palestine as early as the 1930s. Like, I mean, it's there. But how did it make it more into the public sphere in a way that it hadn't in the past? And there are factors. The first is the internet, of course. I mean, the internet provided content. There's more content that you can actually reach. But then in addition to this, the internet-based types of platforms like social media platforms allow an opportunity for mobilization, for people to find each other and mobilize. So that allowed that to happen. And then the more presence on the social media platforms, that allows for some sort of, again, pushing the status quo in a way that it hadn't been done in the past. I also want to mention something that had taken place within American society at large, okay? How the state and society have had a break. In the late 1990s, in particular in Seattle, there was the WTO protest. The World Trade Organization held their first meeting in Seattle, and the protests that ensued really created a new form of protest, but also reaction to protest in the context of the U.S. So that was a moment where the militarization of the police became more legitimized. Okay, soon after 9/11 took place. I also want to say, the idea of militarization of the police, it's not to say that the police had not used violence against defenseless Americans in the past. They have. I mean, we know that in Philadelphia, a neighborhood was bombed by the police. We understand it. We understand the civil rights movement. We understand the complexity of that. I'm talking about a structural transformation in terms of how police departments have become more militarized. There's a program within the American federal government where police departments can have some of kind of military grade equipment passed down from the military. And that existed from the mid-1990s, but it exacerbated after the WTO events because there was a need, there was an argument, we need to do that sort of work from now on to actually militarize the police. Then 9/11 happened, and then that exacerbated. But that created kind of a structural crack, if I may, between how the state versus people, the government versus people, how they saw each other, right? The government saw people as suspects, of course, after 9/11. You don't have to be a Muslim or an Arab to have been pulled aside and harassed at airports per se. But of course, exponentially, it's different when it gets to different racial and ethnic groups. But in addition to this, there's something about how people started seeing the state and the role of the state. People, more or less, and for the lack of a better term, became a lot more pissed off in the years after 9/11, particularly around the ability of the state to get every piece of information about you. Privacy has become kind of more or less obsolete. So people on the right and people on the left, they really had a problem. Remember the Occupy movement, for example? This movement is attributed somewhat to the left because it's class-based around resources and lack of resources for most 99%. But on the other hand, you also have the Tea Party movement, who are also right-wing, more or less, more conservative disposition with regards to politics and society and so on, who were also pissed off. They saw the state as infringing on their kind of rights and their ability to do what they as individual Americans wanted to do. And again, this is something, at times I always think about what are some of the things that piss Americans off. It's kind of wanting liberty. The idea is that this is a very the core value of Americans is to say, oh, I want my liberty. I want to be able to do what I want. I don't want anybody's intervention. Okay. So that's another factor, the kind of militarization of the police, the internet. But again, primarily, which I think we all understand the significance of how definitions with regards to equity and inclusion started emerging. In particular, obviously, with regards to the Black Lives Matter movement, whereby the mobilization took place. And I play a heavy emphasis in the last decade or so on how the Black Lives Matter movement have really transformed conversations and ideas within American society to levels we had not seen before. Now, in addition to the Black Lives Matter movement, you also had the LGBTQ rights and, same-sex marriage and so on. It wasn't a thing. Now it's been 10 years, literally, as of recent, I think. So all I'm trying to say is that all of those things have really came together to create a new definition of equity, whereby it allows for the Palestinian story to be heard and understood. It's not only heard, but understood. So there's something that needed to take place within American society structurally in order for the conversation to become better understood by those who hear it. And I think this is where it's at, whereby how mobilization takes place in the United States around social justice, when you find Palestinian Americans who have immigrated, second, third, fourth, almost fourth generation of Palestinians living in the United States, are living in these communities and understand the oppression that, that marginalized communities are facing and other BIPOC communities. And they themselves now become part of the mobilization effort, hand in hand with Black activists walking down the streets and creating change effectively. So I think these are some of the factors that really played a role in creating a transforming conversation.
Yeah, well, I actually wanted to ask, just this morning I saw this horrific image of a child starving and malnourished. You could see their rib cage in Gaza, and things in Palestine and for Palestinians over the past few years have just been indescribably horrific, right? And in your book, you don't gloss over that, and you don't gloss over the decades of other histories of settler colonialistic violence. But in many ways, this book also tells an unexpectedly dare I say it, optimistic story about the historical arc of attitudes towards Palestine. So have you felt that shift in your own life as well as a Palestinian American and academic?
Thank you for that question, Marcus. I think it really kind of addresses or kind of deals with a very important piece, right? Palestine is a geography, one thing, right? And then the transnational presence of Palestinians, right? So let's talk a little bit about Gaza. I mean, the levels are unprecedented. I mean, the amount of destruction, we should all be horrified. And I know a lot of us are horrified. Oftentimes we move on with our lives and ignore the fact that there are children who are dying, blown to pieces, having no access to food or water, and there's nothing safe in terms of what Gaza looks like. So this is what settler colonialism looks like, right? I mean, the settler colonialism is kind of the effort to replace an entire population over a piece of land. And, again, I mean, we can talk about the historical reasons as to why Gaza looks like it does now, but Gaza has always been, I mean, before the genocide that is taking place in Gaza for almost 2 years now, right? Before that, we had what is described as Gaza was described as the largest open air prison in the world for decades, right? I mean, my point is the idea is it didn't start in 2023, and it didn't start a decade ago. It's been around for a while, right? But one of the things that I've noticed in terms of the things, why Americans don't see the humanity of Palestinians, right? Why don't they understand? Why are they not sympathetic to it? One of those things that I noticed is that the more Israel commits something that is so horrendous, okay, it increases the possibilities of a pushback from those who are against those policies, okay? And over time, that continues to accelerate. So, this is the kind of the acceleration that I talk about in the book, where it's an intensifying and accelerating fight by those who are pushing for equal rights with regards to Palestine, other BIPOC people, and so on and so forth, on the one hand. But then on the other hand, those who are preserving the status quo have an kind of an inherent desire to keep it. Look, I mean, am I optimistic? I don't know. The way I would say it is, I am, out of my pessimism, I see optimism, if that makes sense. Okay. Out of my extreme pessimism, if I might add, out of my extreme pessimism, I see some optimism. Okay.
You may need to trademark that. That's a nice line.
Yeah, someone else will probably do it, but it's all good. I'm sure if a capitalist is listening to this podcast, there's an opportunity for you. Anyway, so look, the story of Palestine is a never-ending story of destruction, never-ending story of violence. And I also want to highlight the fact that Palestinian society was intentionally destroyed and dismembered in 1948. So that intentional dismemberment of Palestinian society led to the creation of so many little pockets of Palestinian societies and communities around the world. Now, those communities have come together effectively, even if they're not physically talking to each other, intellectually they're speaking to each other. They're talking about displacement, they're talking about dispossession, they're talking about who they are as a community that has been pushed out of their homes and so on and so forth. And now those communities, as I mentioned earlier, they're rooted in these new local communities that they found in these societies, and they're able to speak the language of those societies. So there's agency to be given to Palestinians who live outside of historic Palestine, okay? So there's something about violence, as I mentioned earlier. In the second Intifada, which started in 2000, it brought about, up to then, unfortunately, violence had gotten a lot worse. It brought, in 2000, kind of new levels of violence, whereby you had Israeli tanks driving in the streets of the West Bank. In particular, in April 2002, you had tanks rolling down the streets, and the level of destruction and death and was really unprecedented in such a way previously. And again, I don't want to only just highlight this, like it's in a sense, it took us to new levels that we hadn't seen before that. And a number of civil society leaders in Palestine, they came together and they said, look, we cannot effectively only resist in such a way whereby, you resist inside the West Bank and the Gaza Strip or inside Israel in 1948, right? You really have to think about this as an external issue as well, that other people of conscience should exert efforts that will pressure Israel to do or not do certain things, right? And they issued a kind of a call for boycott, which is known as boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS, right? Effectively, that emerged in the early 2000s as a necessity, not necessarily by choice, effectively. And BDS, boycott and divestment and sanctions movement took a life of its own. Like, I mean, it's decentralized. There's not one person or two people. It can be an individual effort that a person decides to not buy a certain product that helps support Israeli occupation. Someone decides to boycott an institution that has connections to Israeli military and so on and so forth, or company for that matter. So it was out of necessity that took place. And look, the way I see it is that the more push against these efforts, the more these efforts are going to find a new way to push back. And that's, again, another level of acceleration that is taking place. There's an acceleration of violence, and there's an acceleration of a narrative, countering narratives that is taking place and taking roots in terms of how the fight is taking place. I mean, look, most news channels in the United States, and we can talk about the media I read about it, but like we can talk about it. We all understand what the media does these days effectively is that oftentimes it looks more like mostly entertainment, partly some sort of news, and the rest is just commercials, So it's just, you're really missing a lot. We're missing a lot from what is happening in the world. And if that's all you show people, that's all will people know. And then when people are able to see what doesn't exist in the traditional sense, meaning in internet, social media, and so on, they start formulating their own ideas in a different way, right? And there's something for example, to mainstream conversations. I mean, there's something powerful about the fact that a mainstream actor or an actress and someone who's a celebrity, there's something very powerful about them saying something about Palestine. Okay. Miss Rachel, who happens to be a Jewish woman, for example, who has a child, took care of a child, kind of an injured Palestinian young girl, brought her on her show, and she basically had a lot of hate directed at her. But she's pushing back. And the idea is that the idea is Palestinians aren't going anywhere, and advocates of Palestinians aren't going anywhere. Okay, the more you push against it, the more it will eventually figure out ways to do it. So I think once things hit the mainstream, they become much more prevalent in the public discourse, in the public sphere. And in some ways, again, honestly, Marcus, it's hard to be optimistic, but I think these are kind of the moments of optimism to say, like, okay, nothing stands stagnant. Nothing remains stagnant. Things change over time. And it's not a one-time thing. Ultimately, equality will prevail everywhere.
Thanks. I'm really glad that you brought up BDS because as someone who's also worked in South Africa, I have a deep appreciation for how important boycotts and sanctions were in the dismantling of South African apartheid. In your book, though, you also look at a spate of new attempts at both federal and state levels to actually make efforts to boycott or divest from Israel, even on a personal basis, illegal, which I just find wild. And I think it reflects what you're saying here about sort of how it's a constantly escalating conflict. And so I guess I'm wondering, what do you see as the future of efforts like the BDS movement, and how will they continue to be effective? Do we need new tools, or do we need to outmaneuver the laws that are being put in place? Like, what does the kind of frontier of U.S. activism on behalf of Palestine and Palestinian equality, what does that actually look like going forward?
That's a great question. I mean, I think the thing that I want to highlight here is that resistance can take so many different forms. Okay, we oftentimes call this is form of legitimate resistance. This is illegitimate resistance. We can talk about this is violent resistance and this is non-violent resistance. Oftentimes we highlight in American society the significance and importance and the moral position of having,
there's like a moral hierarchy of
exactly
yeah.
in terms of nonviolence, right? BDS is a nonviolent movement. I mean, in the sense, like, if that's something to be appreciated, to have a movement that is based on nonviolence, thinking about equality, all of those things are within BDS. And I'm just describing what BDS is. I'm describing what it attempts to do, what it's trying to accomplish. So that on the one hand. Two, I think, look, the fact that there are laws that are being passed. I mean, now we have basically virtually most states in the United States have legislations that not ban, but in the sense to say, like, there's a level of punishment that one would have to endure if they support BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. So let me give you an example. In Texas, in the great state of Texas, for example, there was a moment that if you gave a talk, for example, any state money, you would have to sign a form saying that I will not boycott Israel, or I do not support boycotting Israel, to receive for any reason. Like, I mean, if you're a biologist going to talk about, what biologists talk about, anyway. So, to give a talk at a conference, there was a hurricane, remember, a few years ago, and I mentioned this in the book, in Houston, where if you wanted to receive kind of an aid kit from the city, you needed, I mean, you're talking about people who are of that city, they needed to sign a form that says they're not going to boycott Israel. Okay. So my point is, like, this can get extremely, hairy, to put it mildly. It makes no sense at times. It makes no sense at all, in fact. And especially that BDS, and again, efforts to boycott in general, are seen and talked about and described as anti-Semitic tactics, and so on and so forth. But the interesting thing to me is that the ones who are spearheading a lot of BDS campaigns, locally, nationally, a lot of them happen to be Jewish. I mean, how do you reconcile that? How can one be? In fact, some of them are, in fact, rabbis, right? Like, I mean, but if they come for BDS as such a way to ban certain things, they're coming for other groups and other issues. So let me give you an example. In some states, the law, or the kind of the bills that were used to enact laws against BDS, have been used as a template to ban boycotting companies that fire employees because of their sexual orientation, or declining, for example, medical care because of their position on abortion. So, and also weapon manufacturers. Like, you cannot boycott weapons manufacturing if you want to do business with us, you cannot boycott those weapons manufacturers. So using this as a template is dangerous. So Palestine is at the heart of American politics, whether you like it or not. Mm-hmm. It is at the heart of freedom of speech. It is at the heart of anything in relation to due process. It is in relation to the separation of powers. It is in relation to the very liberty that Americans hold so dear to their hearts, right? That we all hold very dear to our hearts, the liberties, and that we don't want anyone to tell us what to do. Well, as far as I'm concerned, if you need to deal with that, you must address how you talk and think about Palestine. So Palestine is at the heart of everything. Even for those who don't know anything about Palestine, ultimately they'll figure it out, especially, of course, that the United States government has supported Israel and its practices for decades, and we continue to. We send weapons to them, and we use weapons, and then, there are people who have been proven over and over and over and over again to be innocent civilians have been blown to pieces. I mean, how do you describe 55,000 people being blown to pieces, and a good portion of whom are children, Yeah. So my point is, what form of resistance do we have? I actually think people have to pick up the phone, speak. People can protest. There are things that we continue to be able to do. And I think boycott is something, from my perspective, is a very significant right to anybody, even as a, regardless of where you stand on the political spectrum, right or left. Boycott is something that really speaks to your freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and freedom in your ability to do something or not. So I just want to say, like, when people look, I wrote the book. I'm just going to say this. I wrote the book because I have been, I think you mentioned this. It's been tough. It took a long time. Yes, there's an emotional toll that I had to exert as a Palestinian American myself. As someone who sees the racialization of my community and my people day in and day out. Sure, I'm quote unquote white presenting, and I obviously that's privilege, quote unquote, right? Until people say, "What is your name?" And then I say, "Okay, my name is Karam," and people are, "Oh, wait, what is that? That's not a white name, right? That's not a white or black name, or the familiarity of what it might sound, right?" And then there's this, and I'm an immigrant as well. So to navigate those spaces as it is, there's layers and layers of racialization that take place, right? And as I said, I've never met, personally, someone who happens to be black who didn't understand the question of Palestine. Never, okay? I never met someone who has, who belongs to a BIPOC community or marginalized communities, unable to speak or understand the issue of Palestine. It's simply because we speak to each other. We're able to understand the suffering of other people. Not always 100% full understanding, but I think that brings people together. It's no surprise. It's absolutely no surprise that, for example, African Americans understand the experience of people in Khalil, my town. Okay, it's my town is tortured. My town is divided. There's like, there's an H1 and H2. H1 Hebron 1, which is under the authority of the Palestinian Authority, which effectively doesn't have any much authority. And then H2, it's where settlers live in the heart of the old city, right? Next to the Ibrahimi Mosque, where Abraham is buried, and a few other biblical figures and significant people to, for religious reasons. But my point is, like, there's such torture that exists whereby segregation is there. Apartheid is there, and you can see it, and you can witness it, and you can touch it, and you can smell it. Like, it's there, right? So there's a reason why African Americans understand the suffering of my town, understand the suffering of the Palestinians and living under apartheid. There's redlining. There's, I can go on and get down the list. I mean, we understand the kind of the common experience effectively, though the language and the culture is different. But then there's these systems that really continue to push against communities that are marginalized, because those systems cannot exist if there are not people who are marginalized. There's the hierarchy. And if there's nobody at the bottom of the hierarchy, there's no hierarchy.
Yeah. So I do want to ask, and this is with the risk of me sounding like a non-Black person whenever there's conversations about Black people, and they're like, well, some of my best friends are Black. My partner is Jewish, and she's often so frustrated by the media in terms of the erasure, right, of Jewish allyship with the Palestinian cause, and how so often, for instance, she had just brought up the other day that I believe Bill Ackman, it was a hedge fund manager or private equity person. He's very rich in New York. I'll say that. And he was saying that with the Democratic primary victory of Mamdani, that, all Jews need to get out of, I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said all Jews need to get out of New York City because it's no longer safe. And then, there was a few folks who responded and was like, well, we can't get out because we were door knocking for him, actually, as Jewish people. And so I want to ask you, what do you think is the reason that there is such erasure, at least in mainstream media, of Jewish allyship with Palestinian causes?
That's a really interesting question. I think you really raise a very important point. There have always been Jewish people who are against the practices of the state of Israel. I'm not going to even get into the Zionism piece of this, which I can, but I think let's just talk about the simple practices of the state of Israel. There's always have been people against it, okay? In fact, Albert Einstein was against the practice of the state of Israel. And he was saying, like, this is a bad idea. And if we are to face a predicament as Jewish people in the future, it is because of some of us, so highlighted that, right? The change will have to come from within the Jewish community. One of the changes that need to come if we are to reach a moment of equality, right? Let's put it that way. Or how Palestine is talked about without dehumanization, when we start thinking about a Gazan child as equivalent, morally speaking, and in terms of the value of their lives as an Israeli Jewish child. When we start doing that, to get to that, we need Jewish Americans in the context of the United States to really push against the hijacking of their identity, if I may. The identity gets hijacked for political reasons. Is this something that the Jewish American community would like to do? And I'm not Jewish, but I mean, it's funny you said at the risk of sounding, but I do have Jewish friends, as you can imagine. And the idea here is that a lot of those Jewish friends of mine, they struggle with how that conversation is going to happen. And like, in a sense, they notice there's a changing trend within the Jewish American community, because this conversation is an absolute necessity within every synagogue, within every community, whether you're conservative or not. I mean, whether or not it's a good idea to have the Israeli flag on most synagogues needs to be thought of. Is this a good idea or not? Is your Jewishness connected to having an Israeli flag in your own synagogue? That's a good question we ought to think about, right? Does a country that has existed for 77 years at the expense of people who became homeless and dispossessed and refugees and so on, is this something that you would want to identify with and kind of put all your, for the lack of a better term, put all your eggs in one basket with regards to this, versus thinking about Judaism as a very rich tradition, culture that has existed for 3,000 years. So, I mean, my point is, like, to me, it's a conversation that needs to be had within the Jewish American community. Now, why does that erasure happen? It's simply, well, there are a number of reasons, but I'm going to highlight one. It has to do with the status quo. I mean, for the longest time, our government has really presented Israel as it's our ally one way or another. Like, no matter what, we see this today. We see it with Republican administration. We see it with Democratic administrations. We see it during the Kamala Harris campaign, and we see it during the Trump campaign. I mean, Trump started using the term Palestinian as a derogatory term. He called Chuck Schumer, he's Jewish, but he's now a Palestinian. He's a weak Palestinian, calling him such. I mean, there's a level of dehumanization that, like, in a sense, it's like, wow, the term Palestinian is a derogatory term. But part of the problem is that it's eaten up. People are consuming those ideas and they run with it. But this isn't new. When John McCain was running for as the Republican candidate against Barack Hussein Obama, he was asked by a woman who said, like, I heard that Barack Obama was an Arab, and it scares me. And then everyone started clapping. He comes in, he says, no. Look, he is a good man. Okay, we just happen to have disagreements. So the idea is that an Arab, a Muslim, he's a Muslim, not an Arab, but even though how Orientalism is so deeply ingrained in terms of how people see things and describe things and define things. So, but that becomes the status quo. Especially when you have, for example, churches in the United States highlighting the narrative of end of times narrative, John Hagee like type of a narrative, where there will be kind of an end of times war, like end of the world type of war, where we're on this side, we're on the good side, they're the bad side, and everybody will clash, and ultimately that's the return of the Messiah and so on. I mean, the idea here is that the closeness of Israel and the United States is cultural, deeply cultural. In fact, more Zionist. I mean, I even write about this to say that American forms of Christianity are ones that are deeply Zionist in terms of how they see himself, not because of Jewish people, okay, but actually because of how they see the end of time scenario to include Jewish people. So in a sense, it's like a prophecy that has gone wrong, as far as I'm concerned. People have to really be critical. And I think this is where we're at. You find a growing number of young Jewish Americans. And I didn't particularly talk about the younger generation, but the younger generation understands equality and equity in ways that their parents don't. And I also want to say, speaking of younger generation, someone in Seattle, Washington, a young person in Seattle, Washington, is able to speak to someone in Seoul, in South Korea, is able to speak to someone in Tokyo, Japan, is able to speak to someone in Dubai, United Arab Emirates, is able to speak to someone in Gaza, Palestine, is able to speak to someone in Tunis, Tunisia, and France. We can go on and on. They're able to understand one another in ways that they themselves cannot speak or understand their own parents. So we're talking about a completely transforming narrative that is on the horizon. But again, that doesn't mean that there's not going to be a pushback. Pushback is part of the conversation at all times. And again, the pushback will intensify, as I have mentioned previously. I think the harder thing for people, and you see this within, quite prevalent within Jewish American, younger Jewish American individuals and groups, who actually say, my entire worldview has completely transformed. I mean,
Yeah.
one person in particular, Peter Beinart, I'm going to mention Peter Beinart, a very well-known Jewish American scholar. I remember when Peter was an ardent Zionist. He was 100% behind Israel until he actually visited and saw it a couple of times. And then he says, my entire worldview came down on me. Everything completely shattered in terms of how I saw the world. But the idea, it takes time. Things take time. And social movements, as we all know, is not something that happens overnight.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most powerful points that you make in the book is, and I think it's made most clearly in the conclusion, is the idea that Zionism and the perceptions that we have of this conflict are also punishing towards and limiting of Jewish identity as much as they are of Palestinian identity. And I was really struck by your kind of deep dive into the evangelical Christian roots of a lot of Zionism in the US. It reminded me of several new books on kind of evangelical Christianity in the US that have sort of talked about how evangelical Christians see America as the sort of Israel of the West, right? And see these politics as very parallel. And in the book, you quote Tom Driver, this professor at Union Theological Seminary in New York, who has this incredible observation that it is also a great and frightening thing that the most pro-Israeli group in American Christianity is also the most anti-Semitic. Mm-hmm. And as, you know, as a professor and a person who has lots of Jewish family members who has been sort of embroiled in this controversy over the last couple of years and these like upside down conversations about what anti-Semitism is and is not, that really struck me as such a powerful idea that a lot of this is not actually doing a service to Jews either, that all of us are harmed by the kinds of narratives that have been created around this conflict, and the kinds of interests that sit behind those narratives. Am I getting you right there?
Yes, I mean you are, and I think there are different ways I can kind of get into this piece whereby a lot of those who are pushing for the narrative of Israel and kind of trying to preserve the status quo and try to keep the image that they've always had in their minds and so on. There are a number of pieces to this. The first, it has to do with if we are to accept one narrative of what it means to be Jewish, and that is equated with Zionism and its manifestation of Israel, for example, right? That's one thing. So if we are to do that, then criticizing Israel puts you in the definition of anti-Semitism, right? But what about those who are not Jewish? I mean, I think it's actually anti-Semitic to suggest that all Jewish people should be supportive of Israel. That is anti-Semitic, and a lot of people have made that argument that not all Jewish people are the same. And if you are to make, it's a similar argument to say that, using a stereotype to refer to a Jewish person can be, it should not be used on all Jewish people. The rationale as to why, a lot of the Christian Zionists actually, again, not all, but a lot of, let's put it that way, the Christian Zionists are suggesting that, okay, Israel is the manifestation of our one manifestation of the prophecy, and we have to push in that direction and so on. And the more they're doing that, not because of Jewish people per se, if anything, they're doing it because of their own beliefs that will eventually, be the price of which will have to be paid by Jewish people. I mean, the prophecy itself, I mean, it's very interesting. Like a war will happen, Jewish people, a lot of them will die in the war, right? And then those who remain, either they convert or they die. It's like convert to Christianity, that is. And you're like, wait a second, this is kind of an interesting thing to look at. One. Two, to think about the United States, three, actually, this is the third point, sorry. To think about the United States as a manifestation of the new Israel, oftentimes, or the new Jerusalem, or it's in a sense a way to whitewash and create legitimacy for the death and destruction that the United States as a state and as a government had committed against indigenous Black people and BIPOC people in general, right? So the idea here is the more you try to connect yourself to the morality of that piece, the more you connect to say, oh, that was a moral decision, the right moral decision to take, is problematic. This isn't to say that anti-Semitism doesn't exist. It does obviously exist. But at the same time, one cannot put all identities in one, okay? We cannot, I mean, it becomes more or less, we are orientalizing, just like a Muslim and Arab who happens to be Christian can be seen similar to a Muslim, can be seen to someone who's, so similarly, this is an inaccurate way to put them in one category. We cannot put all Jewish people in one category because there's a great level of difference. And oftentimes, there's that idea of us versus them, the Jew versus the Arab or the Muslim and so on. But people, I mean, those who know. I mean, it's simple. Listen, simple research one can look into that a great deal of, what is known as the Eastern Jew, right? People who are from the Arabic-speaking world, whose first language is Arabic. My own town, for example, had a Jewish community in the 20th century. I mean, my point is you had Jewish presence in Palestine throughout the Arabic-speaking world. It is when the settler colonial practices that came from Europe, because of European policy that excluded them, led to another level of subjugation to another people. So my point, and Edward Said said this many, many years ago. He said, Palestinians are being not only asked, they are paying for the price of a crime committed in Europe. Okay. Mm-hmm. And they had nothing to do with it. I mean, the idea is that, if anything, if you notice there's endless examples, anecdotal and so on, and historical evidence to suggest that Palestinians have taken in Jewish migrants who had arrived to Palestine escaping persecution in Europe. So my point is, we really have to stick to it and define what it means to be an Arab, what it means to be a Jew, and in relation to one another effectively. Because if I define an Israeli as someone who has an inherent right to the land, anything that exists there has to be gone. And effectively that legitimizes ethnic cleansing and genocide, and it becomes absolutely normalized. Those people don't even have an identity. They're not even human. So it becomes easy to bomb them into smithereens.
Yeah. Well, Karam, I must say that thank you is not enough for this conversation, but we have the income bracket of a journalist and an academic, and so thank you is pretty much all we have. But in all seriousness, this was an excellent conversation, and just a privilege to be able to talk to you today.
Thank you very, very much, Marcus. I'm very delighted to be part of this amazing program that you have. And I also want to say it's great to always see my dear friend and colleague, Nora Kenworthy. Thank you again.
Thanks, Karam.
Wow. Nora, I didn't think that it was possible to have a conversation about Palestine right now that would give me some hope. But in all honesty, that one actually did.
Yeah. I mean, these are such heavy histories. But I remember I was talking to a colleague of mine who's a public health expert who's worked in war zones all around the world and has been a very long-term, supporter of Palestine. And after October 7th, I remember, having a conversation with her and sort of saying, my God, things feel so terrible right now. How are you doing? And she said, they are so terrible, but also it's been terrible. There was a time when you couldn't say the word Palestine in an academic context. You couldn't write it in scholarly papers. And so as awful as the last couple of years have felt, I think for a lot of people, they have also cracked open this growing movement of people who say enough is enough and this is not okay, and who are feeling empowered to speak. And I realize that's a thin silver lining on a very dark cloud, but it is something that I think is worth recognizing.
No, absolutely. And I think it's also important to recognize it comes at a time when there is more of a democratization, if you will, of media, right? We're not just dependent upon, thankfully, we're not just dependent on broadcast media, right? You have so much that is going on TikTok and Instagram and various other platforms, you know, even as some of these folks are, you know, some supporters and advocates of Palestine are, you know, effectively silenced. I think just the fact that we have so many people who can try to build a critical mass of support, you know, online and on these various social media channels, I think that remains such an important part of this movement.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a place where all of us can say, like, you're seeing what I'm seeing, right? Like, and you're not okay with this, right? And for me, it's really changed the way that I engage with and think about traditional media as well. I mean, it's just really laid bare some of the blind spots of traditional media and the way that it covers this crisis.
Yeah, it's very galling. You know, I mean, Karam had brought up earlier about Ta-Nehisi Coates, and I remember when his book, The Message, first came out and he was going on book tour. A CBS News reporter basically lambasted him about the portion of the book, which is about a third of the book, about, you know, his travel over to Gaza and what he saw. And, you know, it was just so galling to see this on, you know, broadcast TV, where you have somebody attacked for essentially just trying to tell the truth. Well, I guess it isn't that galling in this day and age, unfortunately. But,
yeah. I mean, I think Ta-Nehisi Coates' argument, Karam's argument, a lot of our own experiences are telling us what Angela Davis has been telling us for decades, which is like, our struggles are connected, right? Like, and there's power in that. And there's also awfulness in that, right? And those things coexist at the same time.
Right. But I mean, there's ultimately hope in that, right? That, you know, it's up to us, you know, in our interlocked and interdependent, you know, struggles and battles, it's up to us to get us out of this together. And that is the only way forward, is together.
Yes. Yeah. And towards freedom. So. Yeah.
All right. Well, Nora, on that note, speaking of hope,
definitely need some this week, so serve it up.
Yes. We have come to that part in our podcast where we share our 8 ounces of joy, or what is helping us to get through as we navigate this chaos goblin that is called life right now. I'll start off, and you know, you have a nice one, so I'll let you go after. But I recently was part of this fellowship, the Young American Leaders Project, that it was this cohort of 10 people from Seattle, and we joined other cohorts from 14 other cities from across the United States. And we all descended upon Harvard. And let me tell you, it's called the Young American Leaders Project, but I think the range of age was like 33 to 60. So they're doing some stretching with that young part. I am. Yeah, there you go. But I will say this, like, to be in a room with all these people from different cities, different backgrounds, different walks of life, if you will, and to have them all sort of identify what is the actual problems that are ailing us right now. It was just this wonderful sort of recognition that no longer are people focused just on their own silo in terms of, oh, it's just happening in my neighborhood or my city or this and that. It was truly a recognition, and maybe it's out of necessity just with what is going on in this country right now, probably so. The fact that, look, we need to link together around these issues, like whether it's income inequality, right? Whether it's what's going on in Gaza right now, whether it's you know, what is going on with some of these bills that are being passed over in Washington, D.C.
Seriously.
And, you know, this was truly this recognition, and these from people from like everybody from like the leftists who are the left of Pluto to Republicans who were there, who we were all of an accord on what, you know, on identifying what the issue was. Yeah. And truly, I think it sparked a little bit of hope in the sense that, okay, maybe folks aren't as walled off from reality as I thought, right? Maybe, you know, we truly are living through a shared experience here, and maybe what supposedly divides us isn't quite as acute as we believe it to be. And so,
I love that.
Yeah, that was my hope for the day.
Good for you. And good for you bringing that to Harvard.
Yeah, it's, I had to learn how to roll the, have the hard over enunciated H's and everything. With it worked out. It worked out for the week. Yeah.
I think mine is related. I think that we're starting to see a pattern among these. But like a lot of people, I'm trying to savor the post-election glow of Zohran Mamdani's win, which is just, I think he's a really inspiring figure. And I know it's so important for us to not attach ourselves to a single person and all our heroes are problematic and all the rest of it. But just watching someone speak to the real concerns of a diverse urban population in a large American city and get that much of a mandate was really nice to see. And I know elections are not going to save us right now, but I think what I'm holding on to right now is this like little fact that was like buried at the end of a New York Times article about his win, which was that the progressive group Run for Something, which recruits younger and more diverse Democrats to seek local office. In the days after his win, they had more than 1,100 people reach out to them who are interested in running for something in local offices across the U.S. And I think the thing that I'm trying to focus on is it's not just him. There are really cool young people running for office all across this country. There are really cool primaries going on right now. We can all find someone like him and support them, even if we're not ready to run ourselves. And I think we just got to keep clinging to that sort of energy. So it was nice to have it for a little while. I will also say, so weirdly, I had Zohran Mamdani's father as a professor when I went to Columbia, and he was brutally hard. In fact, I think I had to drop one of his classes because I couldn't keep up with the reading load. So I feel like if he could survive that being his dad, I mean, it's such an intense upbringing, so much brilliance in that family. I have confidence that he can take on the billionaire class of New York City.
I am hopeful as well. And that is where we will leave it, as a matter of fact, for this episode. I will go ahead and read us out as always. Thank you, listeners, as you have made it through yet another week of the Slow Apocalypse, and we are so glad you shared some of that time with us today. As always, a huge shout out to our fearless producer, Jessica Partnow, and to Aham Aluo for providing music for the show. You can find and follow us on your favorite podcast platform or on YouTube, Instagram, or Blue Sky. New episodes drop every Friday. And until then, we'll see you in the meanwhile.